daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Well, good morning, everybody. We are going to be continuing our exploration of the parables this morning by looking at the next one that's published in your little booklet, the parable of the unprofitable servant that's found in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 17. It's probably one of the least discussed, I think, I know when I mentioned it to a couple of people this week that I've been thinking about this and working on this, they were like, what parable is that? Like they never heard it before. And I said, oh, sure, you've heard it. But it occurred to me that probably it is maybe one of the least discussed. Last week we talked about probably the one that is the most discussed and the most explored, which is the parable of the Good Samaritan. So it seems almost proper then that we approach one today that's a little bit lesser, that we talk less about. In many ways, it's kind of an interesting follow-up, from last week, because this one is equally profound, very profound, actually. And the more I got into it, the more I realized this. The parable actually reads this way. Who among you would say to your servant, every single time I get in here, I cannot speak. I talk all day, every day, all week, and this never happens. And I come before you, and I can't. My voice won't work. I don't know what that's about. There's probably the devil's up in this morning. Who among you would say to your servant who has just come in from plowing or tending sheep in the field, come here immediately and take your place at table? Would he not rather say to him, prepare something for me to eat? Put on your apron and wait on me while I eat and drink. You may eat and drink when I am finished. Is he grateful to that servant because he did what was commanded? So should it be with you. When you have done all you have been commanded, say, we are unprofitable servants. We have done what we were obliged to do. So remember again to put this in its context within the Gospel of Luke. If you look at where this fits into Luke's narrative, we have just come directly out of the parable of the mustard seed. Jesus has just told that parable going into this one, which in the context the whole thing, the parable of the mustard seed, is in the context of Jesus instructing his apostles about their mission. That's sort of how this is being surrounded here. He has just told them that there will be, for instance, temptations for them. He has told them that he has instructed them how to forgive, right? 7 times 7. To which the apostles said to him immediately after that, please increase our faith. So that's the context when he follows with the parable of the mustard seed, and then this one comes immediately after that. In other words, he has just instructed his apostles to avoid sin, to forgive one another, and to have the faith of only a mustard seed, so that their work as apostles, as disciples of Christ being sent into the world, that their work would be evident to all, right? So this is kind of like a preparation almost. It's avoid sin, forgive each other, and you do these things. If you do these things, if you have the faith of a mustard seed, then you're going to be able to make me evident in the world. And I think that's kind of the important framework of this. So when you consider it that way, the very next lines are these, the parable of the unprofitable servant. You begin to have the context that to be a disciple of Christ, to be sent on mission for Christ, means that one does what is expected without expectation of what? Reward or gain. Exactly. So there's another very powerful connotation in the Greek word that's used for servant. And I actually highlighted a couple of these words that I found very interesting. Because, it's always kind of rich with some meaning here. So the Greek word for unprofitable, akrestos, is actually, it does mean unprofitable. That's kind of how you can loosely translate that into English. And I checked several English translations, and I think I found only one translation that translates this word as useless. Isn't that interesting? Because that it also carries with it the connotation of being useless. And I don't think it's useless in the way that we think of useless in terms of profit or gain. Like it's a kind of like a zero-sum game, you know? Like this is a useless venture if you are seeking gain. But unprofitable is actually how it directly translates without profit. And I think this is significant because, and you'll see where I'm kind of going with this idea today. It's significant because while the servant's actions, the work is necessary, yeah? The servant's work is necessary. But the servant doesn't deserve any extraordinary praise for doing what is expected, right? This does not mean that the servant's actions are not good or that they're somehow lacking or they're unimportant. But it means that the servant has fulfilled a duty, that's an important word too, that is inherent in his position. Is this making sense to everybody? Okay, so what if I went into my boss, my department chair at LSU, and I said, I met my classes last week every time on time. On time. I didn't yell at any of them. I was nice to them. I covered the material that they're supposed to have, the content they have to have for mastery in this course. I don't get a teaching award for that. Do I? No. No, I mean, my department chair would look at me, well, good for you. Right? Glad you did what you were supposed to do. So no, the emphasis is on the lack of entitlement or the lack of reward or recognition, something you do because it's inherent to your position. How about something you do because it's inherent to your being? Okay, so this is another way to think about this. So think about the unprofitable servant as someone who does something, but it's also an attitude. Service, servant, the servant heart, that's an attitude too. So maybe it's something that's inherent to your position that you do, but if it's inherent to your position, then there's also an attitude that goes with it. Yeah? Tracking? So something that is in your action, inherent to your position, but something that's also maybe inherent to your being. And I think this is where we have to dig a little deeper, because who are you? Who are you? In your being, who are you? This is like Catechism 101, people. Okay, a child of God. Very good, thank you. So you are created, you're a creature, yes. You are created in the image of God. That's our being. We're created in His ineffable image. The other word here, aphelo, which is to owe or to be indebted to a duty, I use that word duty, something that is expected of you. It means to owe, which is interesting, because if you have a duty, it means you owe something, yeah? It's significant because it implies that the servant is simply giving what is owed. And when we think about owing, we think about somehow needing to do, to catch up, right? If you owe money to someone, you need to pay it back. If you owe someone a favor, if you feel like that in your heart, you need to do it. So it's this sense of being indebted to. It underlines the idea that the servant has no claim to any extra favor of any kind because he is only doing what is required of him. And so using my example of teaching as example, well, when I meet my classes and I do my job, I don't get extra money for that. As a matter of fact, I tell my students, when it comes to 50 minutes, like the 50 minutes is up and they're done and so am I, I'm like, okay, they don't pay me to talk to you extra. It's a joke, but of course I would if I needed to. A point is that there's no sense of extra favor involved if I'm giving what I owe to my employer, the state of Louisiana. Yeah, I am simply giving what is owed. So in a theological sense, that's more of a practical thing, but in a theological sense, it emphasizes that humans owe God their service simply because He is our Creator. He's our Creator. So the same way that you owe service to your employer, you certainly owe service to He who is your Creator. There's another word that I find kind of interesting. This word, doulos, which means a servant or a slave, and actually it better translates as slave, which I think is very interesting because it's talking about someone who is in a state of servitude to another or under the authority of another. And I was reminded when I was thinking about this, when I realized that the nuance is really more slave than the way it is translated as servant. So slavery in the ancient world, was not true chattel slavery the way that we think of it in the American experience. I mean, the American experience of slavery is the only true chattel slavery really that exists to that extent in history. But in any case where you are the slave of another, your life and everything that you have belongs to that person, that master. The Kyrios is the word in the Greek. Kyrios, the Lord, the master. That's who you owe your loyalty to, your service to. In a way that goes beyond merely doing your job, it's because you belong to that person. So I found this really a really interesting use of the Greek because it's what St. Paul is writing. In Romans 1:1, where he says, Paul, a slave of Christ Jesus, called to be an apostle and set apart for the gospel of God. This is really interesting because it's the same word that St. Paul uses that's translated in Luke's gospel as servant, but Paul uses the same word and it's translated as slave. Same word. This is obviously not a literal state of enslavement he's describing, but it is an attitude of his complete removal of any self-will, and this is important, this is kind of where I want to go with this today, his complete removal of any kind of transactional relationship. Transactional. Can y'all put a pin in that word? Transactional. There's no transactional approach to the work he's going to do, the work that we are given to do. Paul, a slave of Christ Jesus, called to be an apostle and set apart for the gospel of God. So another thing that I thought about, some of you have been with me long enough, you know how my mind works. So sometimes I go down little rabbit trails, and sometimes they're fruitful, and sometimes they're not. For me, this was fruitful, so if it's not for you, I'm sorry that you don't know what I know. But I did go down a bit of a rabbit trail with this because I thought it's kind of like worth exploring to see if I could make any connections for myself. So I thought immediately, as a medievalist, I thought immediately of the lord-vassal relationship, of feudalism. You think about the Middle Ages, and you think about how, for instance, the lord would provide some care and oversight and protection for whoever that vassal was, yeah? And in exchange for that, the vassal paid the lord honor and homage, what we call homage, yeah? So not because the vassal is going to receive some reward for that, but because it's expected. That's just what's expected. Because the lord in this relationship, the master in this relationship, and in feudal terms it is called a lord, the lord would provide care and protection for this person, giving this person a place to live, providing military protection if necessary, providing whatever that person needed in order to perform the service that was returned to the Lord. This is medieval feudalism. It's how the whole social system of the Middle Ages was set up. And there's this hierarchy of relationship, that everybody's in relationship with the person above them. The ultimate lord, of course, being the top of the pile, would be the king, who is under the service of God, under the divine right system, see? So I thought of this immediately because this is the same situation. The vassal doesn't get anything extra because the vassal does what's expected, but the word choice reflects the relationship between the servant and the master, underlining the duty and what's expected of the servant, while also conveying that there is no expectation for the master to offer something extra. You don't get an extra, wage, or you don't get an extra meal because of this. for simply fulfilling what is owed. So we might be able to see already why this is one of the lesser discussed or less explored parables of Jesus. Can we not? Maybe a little bit? So what is Jesus teaching us in this exactly? Just to serve God and expect nothing in return? Is that it? Is that it? No. Good, thank you. Father's read ahead. Yeah. So the early Christian fathers interpreted this parable in several ways, often kind of emphasizing the nature of this Christian duty, that we have an emphasis on humility, which St. Augustine's really big on humilitas, or our posture or attitude toward God, and the need to remain faithful without expecting reward. But it's interesting that some of the earliest fathers read this eschatologically. Y'all know what that means? Yeah, the end of the world, the end times. Read it from this eschatological, and the end times perspective. Some say that there's a dimension in this parable that points us to that. Because when will we be rewarded? No. We will be rewarded by God in an age that is yet to come. Yeah? Not in this life, but in the age yet to come. But the parable makes clear that the reward is not something you're going to show up and demand or expect. But it's not a right? It's a gift of grace, of God's grace right now. St. Augustine emphasizes, as I said, this humility because he said it underscores the natural relationship between the servant and the master. For his time, it would have been, we talked about this, we talked about medieval feudalism, but medieval feudalism is actually modeled on something that St. Augustine would have been familiar with. The old Roman institution that becomes feudalism of the Middle Ages is actually an old Roman institution called clientage, and it's a relationship between a client and a patron. So the same thing, you have the client is the person who is providing some service for his patron, and the patron then in exchange for that returns that with some protection, some care, make sure that the client is cared for. So there's that relationship it's ancient, and Augustine would have been familiar with that because he's living in the late Roman Empire, so he would have certainly known that. And he saw this as simply a mirror on earth of the relationship between all of humanity and God. It's just a mirror of that. Just like the client-patron is not expected special gratitude for simply fulfilling his duty to the patron, Christians should not think of themselves as entitled to reward simply for fulfilling their obligation to God, such as keeping the commandments. Well, I haven't broken a single commandment today. Y'all, seriously. Yet? Haven't broken a single commandment today. I went to Mass this morning.
That is almost like on that Family Feud, this woman was asked, how many of the 10 Commandments did she break? This was with Steve Harvey as the host, and she said 10.
Well, that's better than 11. 10 commandments.
What have you done?
But do you see my point? If I'm to stand here before you and I say, guys, I went to Mass this morning and I haven't broken any of the commandments today. Exactly. So, but my point is that yes, actually, that's very good. So I need to go to confession now. Except this was instructional. This was catechetical. So, but you see that there is nothing inherently that I'm supposed to be rewarded for because I've done what is expected of me. It's like why the church gives us those precepts, right? That's the minimum that's expected of us. And for Augustine, this kind of reflects the humility that carries with it a connotation to go deeper, to go the extra mile, to do more than what is expected of you. to give generously. And St. Cyril of Alexandria, God, I love this. He drew parallels between the parable and the nature of the Christian life. He says, just as the servant is expected to serve his master, the servant should do so without complaint. No complaints. So Christians should serve God in all things without complaint. Anyone else ever complain to God? Is that just me? Anyone else ever complain? Okay, come on. Come on. You don't have to raise your hand, but I want you to hold on to that thought. Because maybe even right now, you might be thinking of something you've recently complained about, even if it's just to yourself, about something related to serving God, either in your family, because remember, that's serving God too. Either in your family, in your community, your church, something that is incumbent upon you to do as a Christian. So serve without complaint is what St. Cyril says this means. That's a bigger call than it sounds like. Really think about that. That's a bigger call than it sounds like. So, thanks, St. Cyril. Some modern interpretations of this in modern context, this parable is often explored with a focus on themes like humility in the face of a growing human tendency to expect what? What do we expect? We want recognition. We want something more. We want to be noticed. We want to be seen. So I have some thoughts about this, and actually this is where I did the deepest dive, okay? Because I really did have a lot of thoughts about this. Once I realized that when you go and you look at modern Christian theologians and you begin reading what was written about this parable in the 19th and the 20th centuries, something really important sort of you can tease out is that these 19th and 20th century writers are responding to a culture of expectation, a culture that tells us that we are entitled to something. And that's why I titled this slide, no pun intended, I titled it, "With Enlightenment Comes Entitlement." Because what happened is, I think that one of the ways you can interpret this is to look at it as a critique of that great intellectual movement of modernism called the Enlightenment that comes about in the 17th and 18th centuries primarily. Today, I mean, isn't it true? Tell me if you agree with this. Today, many people view their actions and accomplishments as deserving of recognition. Public recognition, yeah? The parable kind of challenges that whole assumption, but we don't hear it that way anymore because our culture informs us that we should be getting recognition. We should be getting notice. I think we've a little bit lost the focus of doing what is right simply for doing what is right, for the inherent intrinsic value of the good that we are to do as created in the image of our God, not because we expect something in return. So it's really interesting sort of modern, I think, social phenomenon. The idea that humanity has become increasingly transactional. Remember I told you to put a pin in that word? We've become increasingly transactional in our outlook, even on relationships with each other. Think about this. The transactional nature of relationships can be seen in everything from our personal relationships, professional relationships, spiritual relationships. While it's difficult, I think, to pinpoint an exact moment in history when this happened, I think that there are several developments that come about because of the Enlightenment that can help us understand this today. Probably contributed to this idea we have about exchange and transaction and the idea of getting something in return. I do something, something should come back to me, right? I do good, good should come back to me. I do something for you, you do something for me. Quid pro quo. Yeah? Is that what Jesus is teaching us in this parable, by the way? Is this what our modern culture is telling us? Yes. Yes. So go figure, Jesus being countercultural. How interesting is that? But there's several things I think that sort of contribute to this. So what can we blame this on? How long y'all got? How long you got this morning? Feeling entitled. This could be why. Any one of these could be why. The rise of individualism, the rise of capitalism. Don't shoot the messenger, by the way. Technology and social media, the decline of community. Philosophical and psychological shifts I want to touch on just for a minute, and shifts in our spirituality and religiosity that are turning up even in the most recent survey of the American political landscape. How many of you have seen that Pew Research just published their 2024 results? Yeah, I'd like to do a whole class where we did nothing but unpack all of that. It's fascinating to look at how, what the shifts are that are going on in the American religious landscape. But there's, and it's not as bad as it was last time. I'll give you a precursor. It's actually kind of reversing itself, which is encouraging. But the rise of individualism, I mean, I think this is huge. This is huge. Arguably, it begins with the Protestant movement, right? The idea of an individual taking upon himself the authority to whatever, critique the church, reorder the canon of Scripture, whatever, however you want to say it. But certainly that's where it begins. But you see it come full flower in the Enlightenment, this and even beyond, because it's reason, it's individual rights. And not that there's anything wrong with that. There's nothing inherently wrong with speaking about our individual freedoms, liberties, our rights that are inherent to what, though? What are our rights dependent upon? Our human dignity that we are given by our Creator and that acknowledges the human dignity of everyone else. Yes? So what about when I lose the perspective that you have dignity and it's all about me? Do you see? So there's this individualism, I think, that the idea of a self, the self as a distinct, independent entity that is not dependent or contingent upon anything around that self. Right? My own welfare, whatever happens to me is within my domain. An example of this, I mean, I don't know how many of you have read this, but I wouldn't recommend it unless you're just really bored. But there's a work that for me, I remember reading this in grad school and thinking this was a pivotal moment. One of the Enlightenment philosophers, Voltaire, wrote a work called Candide. And in Candide, it's meant to be, it's a satirical novel. He's actually commenting about, it's a satire of the age that he lives in. But in that work, this protagonist, Candide, embarks on a journey to discover his place in the world. Okay, now that's the first warning. To discover his place in the world. He is seeking personal happiness. Okay. He is seeking enlightenment. And it's even like written into the text that he does all of this despite the many challenges that he faces personally. And what emerges is this figure who is completely dependent upon self. His human reason, his own autonomy as a human being, and nothing else. Nothing else. Okay, so even if you didn't know that work, I can tell you that it was read by influential people of that age and certainly began to shape the culture that followed. So how many of you have ever heard or are aware of the poem? This is a 19th century poem that's called Invictus by William Henley. Have you ever heard this? I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. Does that ring a bell? It's written in 1875. So, you know, although we'd like to think so, that's not that long ago. Invictus, that word, of course, means unconquered. So if you look at the story of the man who wrote Invictus, you begin to realize, okay, well, maybe he's responding to his personal challenges. He faced an amputation because of gangrene. Then he got, I think, gangrene in the other leg and was going to have that one amputated and sought out all these doctors for different care. Long story short is, he's writing this as his willingness to take upon himself what he saw as the charge to go and get all these different opinions, saved his other leg, and that's the context he's writing this in. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. The problem is that informs a whole new generation of people, that this rugged kind of individualism somehow means that you can do it yourself. And it also lays the foundation for a more transactional way of thinking, by the way, a far more transactional way of thinking, where personal rights, gains, benefits just kind of insidiously creep in. And I do use the word insidious with great intention, because all I have to do is take the focus off of everyone else and put it on me, and what begins to happen? I can become my own God. I can become my own pope. I can become my own, I am the master of my fate. And these things insidiously creep in, and that's because at the root of this rugged individualism is what? Sin. Pride. It's pride. The very opposite, of course, of what St. Augustine is writing about in Humilitas, talking about this parable as having that attitude of humility. Individualism is the very opposite of that. It allows this foundation, and pride is the enemy of everything that is good. It is the sworn enemy of everything that is good. So self-interest. We even begin to view our interactions as being guided by self-interest, where relationships, even friendships, even those that are romantic relationships perhaps, professional relationships, could be seen as ways to maximize our personal advantage. How many of you ever heard anybody say this? Well, I've got a lot of social capital in this situation I could leverage. Have you ever heard that? Like, my social capital is dependent upon who I know. I hear this all the time. Well, leverage your capital. Think about what that means. That's almost utilitarian. Use someone else that you are perhaps in a relationship with to maximize your personal advantage. I think social scientists might agree, and again, I said don't shoot the messenger, because I'm not saying this is inherently evil, but the rise of capitalism, that comes about in the modern age, also plays a role in shaping this transactional kind of attitude. And I think you could probably naturally see why this is. As economies of nations become more market-driven, then our personal economies become more market-driven and focused on profit and exchange. Yeah, I mean, everybody watching their stock portfolios. Nothing wrong with that. But that can become unhealthy. You know, if that is what you are driven by, those values begin to spill over into our accompanying human relationships. And again, I don't think that this is evil. I'm telling you that there's an insidious nature to this. Like everything else, it can become something that is not good. With the rise of capitalism, though, especially from the 19th century onwards, with the rise of the industrial age, the logic of the market based on supply and demand, yeah, we work on supply and demand, has a psychological effect. People begin to have perhaps a more calculative approach. What do I get out of this? What is my return? Just as you might ask when you're making a purchase or a business transaction. So, and I said, don't shoot the messenger. I'm not saying capitalism is inherently evil. It is not. It is not. Save that critique for another time. Don't hit me with that one, okay? Save that for another time. Technology and social media. I mean, in the last couple of decades, we've really seen this, have we not? That just like everything we've talked about, just like the rise of individualism and just like the rise of capitalism, social media and technology, it can serve the good. Everything can be in service of the good, yes? It can be. But it significantly promoted this kind of transactional thinking. Think about social media. How many of you are on social media at all? Why does nobody want to raise their hand? I'm looking around this room going, all of you are my friends on Facebook. So why are you not raising your hands? Okay. If you're on social media at all, you know that what I'm getting ready to say is true. There are actually algorithms built into social media that will reward you for certain behaviors, right? The more you like a particular platform, what happens? You become a top fan and you get a badge. It's true. It's self-promotional. You know, it encourages people to view relationships as how many people liked this post? How many followers does it have? How many views does this have? Connections to be accumulated. So I think that, you know, we run the risk, and I'm not saying, again, this is inherently evil, because it's not, but it carries with it that risk that relationships can be reduced to a series of exchanges in a completely neutral, invisible kind of way. Likes, comments, shares, and often seen in terms of how much value, social capital, one can gain from that. Think about the rise of the 21st century rise of the influencer. The influencer. Think about that. What is an influencer? Right. Who's trying to build their own social capital by developing a large following of people, and therefore they are able to have a voice that will be heard, perhaps, maybe above everybody else's. They also get monetized. That's exactly right. It's monetized as well. So when you think about it, you know, with instant communication, the depth and long-term commitment of relationships can sometimes be overshadowed by this quick surface-level exchanges, because there's always another one just waiting, right? There's lots of people out there. So again, I'm not saying inherently evil, but I think that it's contributed to this transactional understanding that we have. Community, I mean, historically, before the age that you live in, before the postmodern age, and this is speaking as a historian, I can tell you that previously cultures were more communal. We're probably the first to not be so much. With a focus on shared values, a focus on mutual support. Extended families was the norm. I mean, to live with your extended family was always the norm. To live in a community of extended families was normative. Religious communities, even social groups, much more community-oriented. You have this greater sense, I think, of interdependence rather than independence. It was interdependence, realizing that you needed the other person, you needed the other family, you needed the other tribe, whatever it was, that there was a sense of interdependence where giving without expecting something in return was a virtue. I mean, that's how you assured the survival of that community. That was a virtue. But the breakdown of those traditional communal structures in modern society, I mean, let's think about why that is. I mean, why don't we live in that kind of close community anymore? Why don't we?
I think it's because of social media and people, influencers are telling you, it's like you don't need, so much negativity about the community and
Right.
divisive.
And that somehow interdependence is seen as weakness. I'm at a net loss. So that's that's exactly the kind of transactional thing I'm talking about is that somehow we would be at a net loss. And remember, we are going to get back to the parable, but this is important. I think that this is exactly what Jesus would be telling today in our current culture. the reason he would reiterate this message of the unprofitable servant is because that is the exact opposite of transactional. Yeah, exact opposite. Edna.
I'll just say, I've noticed we don't have the professional organizations that meet.
Right.
Because with the internet, so people that I would know in my profession, I know they're out there, but I don't see them.
Right.
Actually, organizations where you met.
Right.
So I have better contact with people across the country in Zoom than I have.
Yeah, the increase of that use of technology. Yeah. Unfortunately, my academic organizations do still meet face to face. I'm sorry, I just came off of a recent meeting where I was on a panel, a church history panel, and somebody actually had presented an entire paper on how the entire apostolic age was one mass hallucination. Yeah. And somebody captured the expression on my face, and it really is priceless. But anyway, but yes, I mean, absolutely, the age of technology, I mean, it's partially due to the fact that obviously we're more urbanized. We're living in big cities, many people are. We are not living in close-knit, perhaps more suburban or rural communities. The impact of globalization, the fact that obviously the world's a big place, and it can become impersonal that way. Changing social norms, which we would save for another time. We won't talk about that, but you all know where I'm going with that. Our sense of mutual obligation has weakened. So this shift has kind of led people, I think, to approach relationships differently, viewing them merely through a lens of exchange rather than an obligation. That word for duty, the obligation that we have to take care of one another. Because that other person is created in the image of the same God that I am. That obligation. There's also been some interesting philosophical and psychological shifts. I mean, if you think about, I challenge you next time you're in Barnes & Noble, just walk down the aisle that says self-help. And you're going to find a recurring theme. Love yourself first. Have you ever heard that? Love yourself first. You can't give what you don't have. Love yourself. And there's truth in that. I'm not saying there's not some truth in that. Remember, there's always an element of truth in these things that sort of insidiously turn us away. But can that be taken to an extreme? Love yourself first? But that's the primary message we get. Look out for number one. Look out for number one. The rise of narcissism as a psychiatric diagnosis ought to be alarming to us. The fact that there are so many who fit that characteristic, who fit that diagnostic manual. I know I said this in here before. Do you remember that every year Merriam-Webster tells us what the most searched word was in the previous year? Like, what is the most searched term that people go to the internet and look up a meaning for? And in 2023, that word was gaslighting. The most searched term. And I'm not talking about the movie. I'm talking about gaslighting as this pathological, psychological behavior where someone else tries to minimize or make you question your reality. It's like textbook narcissism. The most searched term in 2023, what does that tell us about us as a people? I mean, I think these things speak volumes. And then you obviously have these, I think, unfortunately, in a society where transactional thinking becomes more dominant, even our spiritual or, in our case, religious practices can sometimes take on a more quid pro quo kind of feel, where people begin to approach religion with this idea that they expect something in return for their faithfulness or for their participation or for their service. Can you think of any examples of this?
When you hear a lot of younger people that are not, they'll say, oh, church, I just don't get anything out of it.
That was the number one thing on my list. Well, I didn't really get anything out of that. Yeah, I didn't get anything out of that Mass. And I've heard that. Yeah, that music today just didn't speak to me. Yeah, I just couldn't follow that homily. It just didn't do anything for me. Yes.
It seems to me if you go along with these trends, the trends themselves want you to do that.
Yes.
Want you to think it's a good thing. And so that it makes Christianity the most countercultural and ultimately countercultural force there is.
Yes.
How do we live as Christians?
Yes, and that's ultimately where I get to today. So y'all can go home now. You've already heard the end of my talk. That's exactly the point that I get to. But this sort of where we are in this transactional atmosphere is we do find ourselves in this parable with Jesus calling us to be something completely different, something completely countercultural. In some, I'll talk about this too, in some post-Protestant traditions, there's this growing emphasis, and you all know it, a growing emphasis on this prosperity gospel, yeah? Now, I'm saying post-Protestant. I'm not talking about mainstream Protestants that come out of the 16th century. I'm talking about more modern movements in Christianity. There's this emphasis on prosperity gospel where our faith is linked to what? Material success. This transactional mindset where spiritual service is seen as a way to personal abundance rather than a relationship with God, the Creator. So in essence, I think that this gradual shift has come about because of a lot of these influences. But do you see how insidious all of these things are? And how if you took them individually, and this occurred to me when I was really thinking about this, and I actually made a phone call to a very good friend of mine who's a sociologist, and we had this extended conversation about this. How if you took any one of these things in isolation from the other, that it would kind of fly under our radar. But they've all done that until the point where one day we just don't realize that we're being influenced by it anymore. It's not universal. It's not irreversible. It doesn't apply to everyone in this room. And nor does everyone buy into it. But it seems to me that it's a contemporary message of this parable today. Today. Place the highest value on your selfless service, compassion, unconditional love. If we did more of that, we would find ourselves more authentic and less transactional. Serve God. And how do you do that? How are you the unprofitable servant? You serve God, which means you serve who? And going back to our parable last week, without asking who is my neighbor. You serve everyone and expect nothing in return. That is the key to this. Do you realize how many times we put transactional conditions on things we do for other people, even in the service of the Christian faith? Well, those people need to do this. Look what we did for these people. I'm sorry, Father. I'm preaching. I'm taking your role here. But this is key. You're missing the whole point if you want to be a profitable servant and not an unprofitable servant. Right? You expect nothing in return. You do what is required of you. And we learned last week what is required of us. Did we not? We learned that. So the takeaway, I think this is the big takeaway today. Big takeaway, at least for me. We are creatures and we have a creator. Our creator loved us so much that he actually expects nothing in return, does he? We can serve him or we cannot serve him. He created us to be free, completely free. But we are created in his image, and he loved us so much that we are in his very image. So we are a mirror of our creator in the world. And that means that we serve. As Jesus said, the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve. God himself came not to be served, but to serve. And so are we. But that means that we obey. And I love this. I think this is a great way to sort of cap this up is not because we want to be praised for obeying, that's expected of us, but because it's how we are to be him in the world. So obedience, I love this word, and I don't know how many of you know this. The word actually means to hear. It comes from the Latin obedere, which means to listen or to hear. So when you say you're obeying, it means you are listening. Yeah? You're listening. Hear the Lord. If you listen to the Lord, what is his message? Service in humility. And I think the parable reminds us that serving God is rooted in this very, I'm going to go all the way back to the front because I like that particular image. Reminds us that we are, this kind of humble obedience is both an attitude and a duty that reflects our proper relationship with our Creator. And in that right relationship, we are listening. We are obedient. We're hearing and imitating him to the world. So I think this is really a profound message across the ages. And I think maybe, considering this, it might be more important for us to hear this message today than it was for the ancient hearer. And I haven't often said that, right? But I think this is a parable for today. It challenges us to live these countercultural lives of service to God. When I think about the ancient hearer who would have heard Jesus speak this parable, and of course he's speaking primarily to the apostles, but they would have lived in a world where there is this communal interdependence. That's something that they would have understood far more than we do. So I think it's a parable for today. It challenges us not to love myself first or to put me first movement or the prosperity gospel or any of those put something first movements. It is to serve God by serving others and expecting nothing in return. All right, I'm going to step out of the pulpit because I feel like that's what I've done today. And but this one profoundly moved me, and I mean they all do to some extent or another. The one last week was very impactful too. But I think we've heard so much about the Good Samaritan, we've almost become numb to the message. This one, it just resonates with a contemporary message. Jesus is predicting the world we live in. So, all right, any questions or comments? One thing I do want to remind you is that Thursday, Deacon, you had something? Okay, so remind you that this Thursday evening, please come. Please come. I'm going to be doing an exploration of the True Cross. A lot of people have asked about the relic that's in it's on the Marian altar now. Remember that Father Rainey translated it to the Marian altar from our reliquary, the relic of the True Cross. I've had a lot of questions about the True Cross and its history and how do we approach that with any kind of authentic understanding. And so I thought it's a great opportunity to talk about that. I'm going to do that Thursday night at 5:30 and talk about, well, the history, but also how we approach relics in general. And then the other thing I want to tell you is that if you're a woman and you're signed up for the women's retreat and you know you're not coming, please let me know because there's 4 people now on a waiting list, and so I'd like to be able to allow people a slot if we can. Tuesday night at 5:30 or Tuesday evening at 5:30 is the town hall meeting that Father Rainey is doing to discuss our collaborative new family of parishes. So come with your attentive ears and your questions for that. And then the men's retreat. How are we doing on the men's retreat, Greg? Okay. Okay. Okay? Yeah, do not let money stop you. If you can't come, talk to Greg. All right. Deacon, you had a question, comment, observation?
Just a couple comments on the biblical verse you said. And he says, I am a slave to God.
You talking about this one? St. Paul?
Yes.
Yeah. A slave of Christ Jesus?
What I thought was neat, and maybe we don't catch, Paul, said a slave of Christ Jesus, comma, Paul. He's a slave first.
Right.
Now he's being called by Jesus to be an apostle and to go spread his word and everything. So I always thought that was neat when you looked at it. We're slaves first. We're slaves first to Christ, and then we discern where does God want me, what does God want me to do as that slave. So
Very good. That's very spot on. That is very good, Deacon. Spot on.
The other thing was when you showed the chart and that different things. Let's see, this one, the rise of individualism, and you said something. I can't remember what you said. It made me think about our faith and everything. We can have that rise of individualism. We can have capitalism.
Right.
But it has to stay within that framework of our Christian faith.
Absolutely.
And being that slave of God. Because
None of them are inherently evil.
exactly,
Yeah.
that was exactly what I was going to say. They're not evil if we live within that framework of our faith. Because if I have individualism, but I live within my faith, then I'm not going to, I love this, I'm not going to tread on you.
Right.
And I don't have to worry about you treading on me, so we can maintain that individualism.
Right. And there are certain rights that are inherent to our human dignity. That's what our founding fathers wrote about, right? There are certain rights that we have that are inherent to our human dignity.
And we're not going to try to take those away if we live that
Right.
within that framework. Because if I'm living within the framework of Christ, then I know how I'm going to act, how it's going to affect you. And
Yes.
I'm not going to do things that's going to take away that individualism from you, that human dignity, what we're calling it.
Right.
And I think you're right. I mean, this message is very important for us today. The last thing was we talked about at the very end, you talked about doing things and not doing it as a transaction. Jesus talked about this beforehand in different ways. Remember, he talks about, when you pray, don't pray in the front where everybody can hear you. Pray in your room, in your inner room where no one can see you.
Mm-hmm.
He says when you tithe, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is. It's all about doing it. God knows what we do. We don't have to.
The transaction is with God.
Exactly.
Yes, the transaction is with God.
See it. And
Yeah.
the last thing is, I'm kind of aware sometimes I get on Facebook and I'll see a friend will post something, and I'm guilty. I'll look and I see, oh, he only has 80 likes. People, that may be effective. Let me go ahead and like it, just so he'll get another one or she'll get another one. And so you're looking at it. It's kind of weird. I don't want them to have their feelings hurt, so I'm gonna like something even if I didn't. I hate to say it, didn't even read it, but I'm like it. That's where we are. You think, well, are they looking for the transaction?
Right.
So
Right.
it's a strange place.
It is. We live in strange times, yes. But that's why I think this one more than all the ones I've looked at this year since we started this journey together in September, more than any of the others, this one really moved me in some way that I need to reflect some more on it. Even it's today. It's the world it's where we are. It's where we are. So, what would Jesus say to us today? Yes, David.
This is not a direct answer to that question.
Because you set that up like it was.